Hello there, welcome to another video. We are doing something a little bit different this time around, although I'll be honest with you, it feels like I've said that at the beginning of a bunch of videos lately. But this was an idea that kind of came to me today for actually a new series of videos that is I was searching for something on the internet. I was looking for something actually completely unrelated, and I stumbled across this article, and I was curious. I read down through it, and I thought, somebody should write a response to this article because it was really an article that talks about the Bible. I think from the perspective of someone who doesn't place a lot of value in the Bible. In fact, I'm being polite when I say I think. I mean, I'm pretty sure in the article they actually come out and say they don't put a lot of value in the Bible. Um, but yeah, I thought somebody should come up with a response to this from a Christian biblical perspective. And then I thought, well, that might actually make for some interesting content if somebody were to try to respond to this. And so out of that one idea, the idea for a series in a broader sense kind of came along, which is what if we had a response series where we offer responses to various things that are floating around out there. So this article, the title of the article is 11 Kinds of Bible Verses That Christians Love to Ignore. It's published on a site called salon.com, which is not a site that I'm familiar with at all. The article was written by someone named Valerie Tarico. I'm also not familiar with the author. There was a link on the site to click to see some of the other articles she had written. And just out of curiosity, I took a look. Some of the other articles were Evangelical Christianity is facing a political crisis. Roy Moore's behavior is perfectly biblical, and that's the problem. How the Christian right sex hang ups turn Zika into a bigger crisis. Evangelicals believe in Trump. Their devotion to a bigoted bully actually makes perfect sense. And there's other articles. So it's possible here that she has an axe to grind against Christianity, maybe. Um, but even if true, I think that's okay. I don't feel like I necessarily need people to be friendly or positive toward the Bible before I'm willing to share with them. I think in the last video, we talked a bit about the parable of the sower and how that really calls upon us to just share regardless. And I think that's what we have to be willing to do. If we'll only share in environments where everybody's super welcoming and super excited to hear us come and talk about what the Bible has to say, we might not get to share much at all. But I was thinking, or hoping, perhaps optimistically, that there could be some real value to this because, from my perspective, so much of our society is so divided today that I don't know how much cross culture dialogue we really engage in. Like, does Valerie Tarico have a number of solid Christian friends that she can run her questions or her points by? Maybe, I really don't know. But my point is that a lot of people don't. A lot of people just kind of tend to hang out for the most part in their own echo chambers, and they can raise these types of questions and they can start thinking that, well, I guess nobody's answering my question, so I guess my question is unanswerable. But the reality is they've just never stepped outside of their bubble to talk to someone from a different worldview who maybe could answer their question. So I think there's value to exploring it at least. So let's take a look here. Let's take a look at the 11 kinds of Bible verses that we love to ignore. So the article here is broken down into sections. The first section here is weird insults and curses. She quotes the Ezekiel 23, verse 20 passage. She lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys and whose emission was like that of horses. And I think, honestly, I've it's one of those kind of oddities that I've probably had more unbelievers quote this verse to me than believers. It's almost like there's a perception in the unbelieving world that Christians have no idea that this verse is even in here, and that Christians are just going to freak out if we ever happen to find it. But in actual fact, I've read the book of Ezekiel. I've read all of it. I'm aware of this verse. Um, and in terms of what's going on here, in terms of, I guess, what to make of the Bible as it relates to this text, I would say, it's a bit weird. It's unusual. I will grant that. But it's intended to grab the attention of the reader. And I mean, I guess it's done that because people are still writing articles about it thousands of years later. But what's going on in Ezekiel chapter 23 is that God is speaking these prophecies to the nation of Israel about the judgment that is coming to them shortly. They are about to be exiled into Babylon. And God is speaking here through his prophet as to why that's going to happen. And he talks about talks about Israel chasing after these false gods, and he likens the Israelites who do this to something like an adulterous wife, an unfaithful wife to him. And actually, we find very similar language in the New Testament in James chapter 4, likening this desire to kind of play the field between what we believe and who we're willing to submit to as like adulteresses. But it actually goes even more than that, because I've heard about, unbelievers will point to stuff like this, and they'll talk about God as if he is some sort of um, weak-minded individual with a fragile ego, that he can't handle Israel going off and looking at somebody else. But we need to understand this runs a little bit deeper than just where Israel's affections lie. When God talks here about pagan worship, he actually mentions in the very same chapter, Ezekiel 23 also says, and even made their sons, whom they bore to me, pass through the fire to them as food. Now, what this verse is talking about is, in pagan religions, it was common that you would take a newborn baby and you would burn them in fire as a sacrifice to these pagan gods. And so as Israel had started following these pagan gods, they had picked up these same practices too. So it's not just about Israel being kind of flighty with their affections. It's about infanticide and numerous other things that Israel is caught up in. So God isn't just coming alongside them here and saying, Israel, you're not doing great. I wish you would try harder. This is God saying to them, Israel, you are a bunch of filthy, disgusting whores. That's the sense of the language that God is using in speaking to Israel here. And again, if that kind of language causes us to, raise our eyebrows a bit, that was the intent of the language. God wasn't trying to be diplomatic. He wasn't trying to mince words. He was trying to shock the reader so that they would understand the extent of just how evil and just how disgusting their behaviors had been. So again, if the verse is striking to us, well, good. That it was meant to be. That's why he said what he said. And then underneath we have this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 28. You will be pledged to be married to a woman, but another will take her and rape her. You will build a house, but you will not live in it. You will plant a vineyard, but you will not even begin to enjoy its fruit, and so on. Well, this in Deuteronomy chapter 28, this is a summary passage of the things that will happen to Israel if they break the law that was given to Moses for Israel to follow. There's actually a similar passage in Leviticus chapter 26. And essentially what God is saying here in this chapter is there's a covenant between God and Israel, and that covenant has commands attached to it, which is the commands of the Old Testament law. And Israel, if you keep the covenant, if you keep the terms of the covenant, then good things will happen to you. The article neglects to mention that Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26 are both blessings and curses chapters. They list out, if you keep the covenant, here are all the good things that will happen to you. But if you fail to keep the covenant, here are all the bad things that will happen to you. So there's good and there's bad. Now, the irony is, of course, because this is all about keeping a covenant, the irony is if Israel was so truly disturbed about the bad things that might happen to them, they could have just kept the covenant, and none of these things would have happened to them. But we just read from the book of Ezekiel about how Israel behaved within the context of this covenant. So these consequences written long, long, long ago about what would happen, ironically, a lot of the consequences were written regarding the potential for military defeat and exile and losing your land. And these things would all happen if Israel violated the covenant. Well, they did violate the covenant, and the Babylonians did come in and defeat the Israelites, which is the context we just looked at in the book of Ezekiel. So here in the law, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, God tells Israel, this is what's going to happen to you if you break the covenant. And they broke the covenant. And the things that God said would happen, happened. So these things, I mean, they're not even, they're under the section here of insults. They're not even really insults to my mind. This is God using dramatic language for dramatic circumstances, right? If you're in a building and it's on fire, you yell fire. You don't yell, well, actually, you don't come up and tap someone on the shoulder and say, could I bother you for a couple of minutes? No, because mincing words when something huge is going to happen isn't helpful. And so in these passages, God doesn't mince words. He tells them exactly what's going to happen, and he uses dramatic language because it's dramatic. Section 2 here is awkwardly useless commandments. And there's a couple of references here from the book of Leviticus, which, again, if it's not unbelievers quoting Ezekiel, it's unbelievers quoting Leviticus. So the one thing I want to address, and I'll say this kind of up front because there's a bunch of Leviticus references throughout this article, and I think it's an important thing to understand. The people that don't follow the Bible, there seems to be this really, really common perspective that for Christians, there's essentially two ways to deal with these Leviticus passages, right? Either we follow them, or if we don't follow them, we just kind of pretend like they're not there because we wish they weren't, right? That seems to be, from the perspective of the unbeliever, that seems to be the only other option, right? That, okay, I get that Leviticus says I can't eat pork, but bacon's really tasty, so I'm just kind of pretending like I don't see that verse. But that's not true. That's not true to what the Bible actually says, right? If we're going to have a conversation around what the Bible says, and we are going to not ignore what the Bible says, because this article is kind of suggesting that we shouldn't, I agree, we shouldn't, well then we should do what the Bible says and not do what the Bible says not to do. So let me be super clear about these kinds of passages in the book of Leviticus. I don't follow these types of verses as commandments, and the reason why I don't follow these verses as commandments is because the Bible does not call on Christians to follow these verses as commandments. Let me give you an example. When we read in Genesis about Noah building an ark, we don't run out and build an ark, right? I mean, have you ever seen Christians saying, oh man, I got to get going on my ark? No, of course not. Why don't Christians build arks? Because we understand that when we read about Noah and the ark and the flood narrative, the building of the ark is really an important part of the narrative. But just as important as the building of the ark is the fact that all of this was given to Noah to do. God didn't say in the text, I want everybody to build an ark. He said, I want Noah to build an ark. So when we read through the book of Genesis, we're not ignoring the flood because we don't build an ark. We don't build an ark because the text doesn't call upon us to build an ark. So now, if we hold on to that theme, if we look at the giving of the Old Testament law to Israel, that begins in Exodus chapter 20 with the giving of the Ten Commandments. If I jump over to here, you should be able to see that. Yeah, so there's Exodus chapter 20. And as I say, there's the beginning of the Ten Commandments here, but the actual entirety of the Old Testament law goes all the way through to the end of the book of Exodus. The next book is Leviticus. Right after that, there's more Old Testament law in there. Then the book of Numbers, there's more Old Testament law in there. Then the book of Deuteronomy, there's more Old Testament law in there. So this is where it starts, but it goes on for like 4 more books. There's a lot of Old Testament law. But here's the beginning. Now, I will say there are some Christians that will say, well, we're supposed to keep the Old Testament law because it's in the Bible. Well, if we're going to hold to what the Bible says, here is the beginning of the law, Exodus chapter 20. Let's go back a chapter to Exodus 19, and let's look at kind of the preamble to the giving of the law. So Exodus 19, beginning at the beginning of the chapter, verse 1, in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out from the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. I will jump to verse... Actually, let's go to verse 3. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, this is what you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all of the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So, who is in view here in this passage? Israel. And God reminds them, well, you remember how I brought you out of Egypt. Who did God bring out of Egypt? Israel. Well, who did God tell Moses to relay these commands to? The sons of Israel. And what does God say? He says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. Going to make a covenant with who? Israel. And within that covenant, you need to keep all of these commands. So all of the Old Testament law is a series of commands that fall within a covenant between God and Israel. So if somebody asks me, what do I do with these Leviticus passages? Well, I read them and I understand them. I don't follow them because I'm not a part of this covenant, because I'm not an Israelite. I never was, and I never have been. So the law here isn't written to me to follow. Just as the ark was not written to me to build, the law is not written to me to follow. So there's a fundamental flaw in the argument of this article when it kind of suggests that, oh, Christians just kind of look past these Leviticus passages because, they just kind of pretend like they're not there. No, actually, I've studied through the law many times. I mean, I would like to study it more. I'd like to understand it better for sure. But I've studied through these books of the law many times, but that I don't try to follow them as commands because I'm not supposed to. That's not what the text says. I mean, the other thing that we could go into is that God describes this relationship between himself and Israel as a covenant. Well, the only context that we really use the word covenant in present day terms is in a wedding ceremony, right? We talk about a marital covenant. Well, here's the thing about a marital covenant. The marital covenant is from the wife to the husband and from the husband to the wife and nobody else, right? If you were the best man at the wedding and they're reciting their vows and they're entering into their covenant, and you're the best man and you step forward and say, oh, me too, by the way, me too, I'll be married to the wife as well, she seems nice. Nobody's going to go for that because that's not how covenants work. You don't just add yourself in to a covenant. That's not how it works. And so here in Exodus chapter 19, God is making a covenant between himself and Israel, and the law falls within the context of that covenant. And so for anybody else, I mean, I don't have to eat bacon. I'm not obligated to eat bacon. But if I refrain from eating bacon because I think I'm following the Old Testament law, I'm just not, right? All I'm doing is not eating bacon. I'm not in any part of this covenant. It simply wasn't written to me. It wasn't given to me. That's just not how it works. So as I said, I don't ignore these commands from Leviticus. And it's not because, I really, really want to wear mixed fabrics. I just don't follow them because the text doesn't call upon me to follow them. So, I mean, we could read that and we could say, well, that's just really moving the question in a way because, okay, you're not going to follow the commands, but why did Israel have to only wear certain fabrics? And that's actually I guess I would say a larger question. There's a few different answers to that question. The first thing I would say is that one of the purposes of the Old Testament law was to set Israel apart as a different people. They were intended to be one people under one God, and that differentness was intended to permeate through every aspect of their life. So how they go to work, how they buy and sell, what they eat, how they dress, how they worship, how they relate to other people. It's supposed to permeate through every aspect of their lives that they are a different and unique people. The other practical thing going on at the time that the law was given, and we talked about this a little bit already, was that pagan worship was rife in the nations in and around Israel. Very, very common in other people groups. So some of the aspects of the law was intended to separate Israel from that style of pagan worship. So there wouldn't be kind of blurry lines between what Israel does and what the neighboring nations do. There would be a clear differentiation. That's why some aspects of the law are in there. But the other thing that the Bible tells us is that the Old Testament law was intended to be a picture for what people of faith in God would be like. To think of it another way, if you are a Christian, but you think and act and speak and behave exactly like all of your friends around you who are not Christians, you may not be a very good Christian. The whole purpose is that we're distinct in numerous different ways from other people who are not Christians. And so the law of the Old Testament is intended to paint a picture of that distinction. So down to these silly food rules and whatever, it's the exact same thing going on. Let me cut back to the article here. Number 3, silly food rules. All that have not fins and scales in the sea, all that move in the waters, they should be an abomination. Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk, and so on and so on. This is all kind of under that same umbrella of helpful for Israel, were they to actually keep these rules, but depicting what people of faith would do and what they would look like and how they would behave. But ultimately, as commands, they're part of the Old Testament law, and they're not something that I'm, as a Christian, called to follow. The article says here, where is it? Yeah, right here, the last sentence in the paragraph here. As is, Christians simply ignore the eating advisories in the Old Testament, even though they claim that edicts like the Ten Commandments and the anti-queer clobber verses still apply. Well, no, as I just talked about, the Ten Commandments are written in Exodus 20. They were written to Old Testament Israel, as we saw in Exodus chapter 19. So no, I don't agree. As far as the anti-queer clobber verses, I'm not sure what that's referring to. They didn't define that, but for sure, Leviticus chapter 9 and Exodus chapter 23 are both chapters of Old Testament law. So we're not ignoring them. We're just applying them correctly and noting that we are not called upon them to follow as commands, because we're Christians, not Old Testament Israelites. Section 4 here, holy hang-ups about genitals. So the passage here, when a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything also on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean. So yet again, this is a passage from the Old Testament law. Just as I said, there's a bunch of Old Testament references here. I will say from the perspective of Israel, there is a practical application here. A tight-knit people group living thousands of years ago where there was essentially no medical care, living in a warm climate. Some of these passages do have a practical aspect of cleanness to them, of simply avoiding the spread of disease. In 2021, of all times, I think we know a fair bit at this point about not making contact with surfaces unnecessarily, and or cleaning them when we do. But again, though, I think the law here serves as a picture, and the picture, I think, is a contrast between the uncleanness of sin and the cleanness of forgiveness, the washing clean of sin that God offers. And so were God to pretend that sin and righteousness are basically the same thing, that's not true. So that doesn't really help anybody. So the law here, God often will contrast between clean and unclean things to illustrate that contrast, that in, I guess I would say, in a spiritual sense, you can be clean and you can be unclean as well. So the law is acting as a picture in that sense, as we talked about before. The second passage here from Deuteronomy chapter 25, this one's actually a bit more interesting in that it invites some exploration. Deuteronomy 25, when men fight with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who's beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Deuteronomy 25, 11 to 12. So, once again, Deuteronomy 25 is yet another passage of various and sundry laws in the Old Testament again. But I think still there's benefit to understanding what's going on here. Um, the first thing I would say is that the passage, I think, emphasizes the great value and reverence that Israel had for reproduction and for childbearing. That's why I believe there's any commandment at all on this matter, right? That's why the law has anything at all to say about this, because from the perspective of the law, people can evidently fight. People can step in to defend those who are fighting, but once you start potentially impacting the ability of somebody to reproduce, that's when the law steps in. And I say impacting the ability because the concept of an eye for an eye was a significant part of the Old Testament law, and that would have still been prevalent in the law. So, just like today, you don't implement part of a law in a way that violates a different part of the law. You implement kind of all of it together. So even though the text here says in English, um, the woman puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, the commentators that I've read suggest that what the text is really driving toward is the sense of injury to the man that is grabbed or seized or whatever word you want to use. Because if the man is just simply grabbed and it's, kind of awkward, and then the woman loses a hand as a result, well, that's a clear violation of an eye for an eye, right? Which is a significant principle through the law, as we said. So I think what this is talking about is a response to an actual injury on the part of the man. He hasn't just been grabbed, he's been grabbed to the extent that now he is injured in some way. And the last thing I'll say on this is that when we read things like this in the law, we need to understand what it means. Um, it's it's to be taken in a similar way to how we write laws today. When the text says that you shall cut off her hand, this is not prescriptive in the law in terms of this is what you have to do. What it's doing is it's making an allowance for this in the law that you can punish up to this point as a response. If you consider a present day example, in the US today, for example, some states have the death penalty for crimes like murder. And what that means is that you can seek up to the death penalty for a murder conviction. But not everybody who's found guilty of murder is put to death. That's not what the law means, right? It means that you have legal grounds to seek up to that level of punishment. And so, in the same way, the Deuteronomy passage provides grounds up to the severing of the woman's hands, but I don't know how often that actually happened. I can't think of a single example in the Bible where anything like this played out and the woman's hand was cut off. But yeah, we need to understand how the law is written. It's not prescriptive that exactly that thing must happen. It just is giving a grounding that's the scope within which you can seek discipline against the woman. Now to number 5 here, God's temper tantrums. So the article makes a statement here. Modern Christians may talk about God as a loving father or even a Jesus buddy, the kind you'd want to play golf with, but in reality, Bible God goes out of his way to be intimidating. Worse, he appears to lose control of his temper at times, lashing out like an oversized, thwarted 3-year-old, and his earthly representatives, including Jesus, do the same. I guess the first thing I would say in response to that, she says I'm not sure what a Jesus buddy is. I don't know what that means. But thinking of God as someone that you play golf with, I kind of see God more as like the ruler of the universe and appropriately recognized as such. I think if we start comparing God to like a golf buddy, I've not ever heard that from a Christian, but I would suggest that's kind of a misrepresentation of who God really is. It's not that he's not good, but he's the ruler and creator of the universe. It's not like you don't walk into God's house, give him a fist bump and grab a beer out of his fridge, right? I I think that might be kind of irreverent in how we view God. Um, but anyway, there's two passages cited here. There's Elisha and the bears from Second Kings, and then there is Jesus cursing the fig tree from Matthew 21. So Elisha and the bears. Elisha is God's prophet, and I think here the first thing I would say about this passage is the fact that, again, the fact that there's any response at all in terms of what happens demonstrates a couple things. The first is the fact that the prophet is to be treated with reverence, just as we treat God with reverence. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that you equate the prophet as being equal to God, but both deserve reverence. And secondly, obviously, God himself values that reverence because when it's violated, as it's violated here in this passage, God clearly chooses to respond. The other thing I'll say about this passage, some of the language here makes, I would say, probably makes the passage sound worse than it really was, because it talks about some boys coming out of the town. The first thing I would say about this passage is we're not talking about children here. When the text uses the word boys, we need to understand that, first of all, Old Testament Israel was not a super safe place to be. When people traveled between cities, they often traveled in caravans just purely for safety. They traveled in large numbers. So Israel wasn't a place that you would have, little kids running around outside of walled cities. That's just not what you would do. So the word used in Hebrew that's translated as boys here refers more to young men, not to children. And the second thing I would say about this text is it says 42 of them were mauled by the bears. I will say I don't believe, when we read this passage, I don't believe that there were massive injuries or deaths going on here. There was an attack and the boys were driven away. Probably some got some nasty cuts or scratches. But just the reason why I say that, the reason why I don't think there was any massive injuries or deaths, if you think about it, so there's 42 guys here, right? And if the bears come out and they're just tearing these people to shreds, if you're guy number 42, are you really going to wait around for your turn? No, of course not, right? If bears came out and ripped apart 2, 3, 4, 5 guys, the rest of them would take off running, right? How many people would really be impacted? 10, maybe? My point is, if there's 42 guys here and 42 of them are killed, why didn't any of them leave? It doesn't make any sense to me. So I see this more as like a chaotic, discoordinated type of attack. Some people probably got knocked over. Some people maybe got clawed. They might have had nasty cuts, like I said, scratches, probably bruised up a little bit. But I'm not seeing this as like large-scale carnage that we sometimes can read into that passage. And to the second passage here, Jesus cursing the fig tree, the important thing that's going on here is that the fig tree was often seen as a representative of Israel. It was like a symbolic representation of Israel. And so in a few passages in the Bible, Jesus warns that as a result of the sin of Israel rejecting him and crucifying him, that Israel would be laid low for a while. But that they would be reestablished as a nation later. And interestingly, after the crucifixion, Israel was defeated by the Romans in AD 70, and they didn't become a nation again until 1948, just like Jesus said would happen. And so Jesus represents that visually by putting this curse on the fig tree. He's saying that the fig tree wasn't bearing fruit, which was a statement on the faithlessness of Israel. And so as a result, he puts a curse on it and he lays it low, demonstrating what's going to happen to Israel. But for this passage, I mean, if we're going to accuse God of being some enraged, megalomaniacal, crazed being, well, who's the victim in this passage? A fig tree? I mean, let's be honest. How concerned are we about the condition of an Israelite fig tree from 2,000 years ago, right? I don't know that there's any major victim in this passage. But the last thing I would add too, when we look at passages like this, is when people add in this context of an angry, enraged God, where do you see that in the passage? Particularly if we look at this second one here of Jesus cursing the fig tree, I'm not seeing any language of anger or rage or a temper tantrum, as the article describes it. I'm not seeing any of that. So, I mean, my counter to the article calls out that Christians need to stop supposedly ignoring parts of the Bible. Well, okay, I totally agree. But as the opposite side of that same coin, can we also agree not to add commentary to the Bible that's not written there? When you're writing about, Jesus throwing a temper tantrum, and I don't see any such thing in the text. You're just applying your own perception of emotion into the passage. But it doesn't say anything about that in the passage. That's just your commentary. So number 6 here. Times when the Bible God is worse than Satan. So the article says here, if you actually read the story, Satan doesn't do much other than to tempt people into disobeying the dictates of Yahweh. Well, yeah, okay, just like the Canaanites burning their children to death were just disobeying the dictates of Yahweh. Nothing more than that. That's all. It says that the article says some of the stories are so bad, even Hollywood, with its passion for glorious biblical sex and violence, won't touch them. Okay, which biblical stories are too much for Hollywood? What are we talking about here? The article goes on, especially the plentiful Bible stories about sexual slavery and human sacrifice. Again, what are we talking about here? What stories about sexual slavery and human sacrifice? I mean, I'm happy to respond to this article, but when you just, bounce stuff off the walls like that without actually saying what you're talking about, then it's difficult to come up with a response. So let's move on to the passages here. Numbers chapter 31. Yeah, this is a tough passage. Numbers 31. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man intimately, but all the girls who have not known man intimately spare for yourselves. So the very first thing I'll say about this Numbers 31 passage is it's helpful to remember perhaps that not all Bible passages are warm, cozy, cuddle up, read by the fire type of moments, or, high five, yay God, awesome type moments. I was talking to somebody a little while back about rape in the Bible, and specifically about how it was handled through the Old Testament law. And I reminded them that when we have a court case today, like say a rape trial, we don't walk out of the courtroom when it's all over, all smiles and backslaps and, high fives and that was awesome. Because in our culture, it's necessary to put rapists on trial It's necessary to have a trial in a courtroom setting, but nobody likes it. It's not good, but it's necessary. So, I mean, it would be weird, right, for somebody to enjoy a rape trial. It's not fun, it's necessary. So, here, when we read in Numbers chapter 31, the Midianites have long been a enemy of Israel, and they've tried a whole bunch of things to stop Israel, to attack Israel, to corrupt Israel, to really do whatever they can come up with to damage them in a variety of ways. They tried to, at one point, they tried to hire a prophet to curse Israel. In Numbers chapter 25, we're told Midian women attempt to come in and corrupt the Israelites through sex in a sexual context. And now here in chapter 31, finally Israel goes to war with Midian. They basically say, okay, we're going to resolve this. So Israel attacks Midian, and the text here tells us they kill the Midianite men of fighting age, and they think they're done. But Moses says, no, you can't stop there. You have to kill the young boys, and you have to kill the women who have been intimate with men. And they go and they do it. Now, I've heard a few justifications for why this happens. I think the only why that we can speak on definitively is the text tells us that in the case of the women have used their sexuality deliberately in order to attempt to corrupt the Israelites. So I think that's why in the text, the women that have known a man intimately are put to death. The women that haven't known a man intimately are spared. It's simply because if the attack of the Midianites was came from the women and was sexual in nature, well, if the women are virgins, they're clearly not involved in that attack, not involved in that attempt at corruption, so they don't pay the penalty for it. But as an overarching principle, I'll often say to people with passages like this that if God is truly in charge, if he's truly in charge of people, then he owns every death of every person since the beginning of time. When people look at these apparent death penalty type situations, God is allowed to do that. He ultimately brings every life to an end anyway at a time of his choosing, and he's allowed to do this here. He's allowed to bring lives to an end as a response to some specific situation. And that's what he does here. That's just the reality of it that I think we need to accept, because, as I say, when we look at the deaths of the women and the deaths of the younger guys, we can look at that and go, well, why is he doing that? Why does that make sense? Well, we can spend time on the why, but ultimately it doesn't matter, because even if we can't figure out why, God still has the authority to end lives whenever he chooses, right? If we really, really think we're in charge of how and when our lives come to an end, or the lives of the people that we care about, I would submit we're just living in denial. We're not in control of that at all. It's out of our control. It's in God's control. He gets to choose. And here he chooses that in response to all of the things that the Midianites have been doing, now he is going to bring a bunch of lives to an end. But again, though, as a general principle, and we talked about something similar earlier on, if you don't want to get caught up in the discipline of God, then don't seek to undermine his purposes, right? This is it's a truism that sometimes bad things happen to good people. That's sometimes true. But at the same time, if you don't want to be wiped out by God for your gross disobedience against him, then don't live in gross disobedience against him, right? Why, as I said, some bad things might still happen to you, but if you're not openly rebellious against God, then at least you take away that card, if you like, that he's not going to punish you for rebelliousness if you're not living in rebelliousness. Now, to the second passage here, Josiah. Josiah executed the priests of the pagan shrines on their own altars, and he burned human bones on the altars to desecrate them. Yeah, I guess I would say here a lot of the same principles apply here around life and death. It says here with Josiah in 2 Kings, he executed the priests of the pagan shrines. That's actually not against the Old Testament law. That's actually in accordance with the Old Testament law. As I said earlier on, God takes pagan worship really, really seriously. And the penalty for leading pagan worship was the death penalty. This is all written into the law. The passage says here, obeying all the laws of Moses. Yeah, that's true. Josiah did not operate outside of the law. He operated within the law. This was something deserving of the death penalty and codified into the law. And as part of the covenant that Israel were under, Josiah followed the law. He executed that judgment. Now, as far as burning human bones, that kind of might strike us as a little macabre, and we might read that as, well, Josiah's gone crazy here. He's just, he's enraged. He's gone nuts. But the text says why he did it. He did it to desecrate the altars. What that means is, when we talked earlier, Israel had some strict laws around, dietary things and cleanness and uncleanness. And one of the things that Israel was strictly to avoid was dead things. Dead things make you ritually unclean. So what Josiah is doing here is he's putting to death the pagan priests, as we talked about, and then by burning these bones on the altars, he's making sure that nobody will come back and pick it all up again the minute he leaves, right? In present day, in a situation comparable to this, we would rent some heavy equipment and we would tear down the altars and we would, load everything into the back of a truck and we would take it away to the dump and now it's gone. Well, Josiah didn't have a lot of heavy equipment available in ancient Israel. So what does he do? He takes dead remains and he spreads it around at the altars. And because the Israelites won't go near anything that's dead, he's essentially accomplished the same purpose, that they can't just come back and pick it up and continue the minute that he leaves. That's the motivation that's going on here. The next point here, instructions for slave masters. So the first thing I'll say here on this point is that slavery was a thing in the ancient Near East. It certainly did go on with these people groups and in this area. So what the Bible did was, on the one hand, it didn't necessarily advocate slavery. I was talking out to a friend of mine just recently, and I mentioned that in present day, at least where I live, we don't have slaves. But here's the thing, I'm not breaking a single command of anything anywhere in the Bible by not having slaves, right? There isn't a book, chapter, verse that someone could hold up to me and go, John, where's your slaves? You're supposed to be doing this. So the Bible does not advocate slaves. It doesn't mandate slaves. But conversely, it doesn't condemn ownership of slaves. What the Bible does is it contains commands limiting the ownership and treatment of slaves. So I think one key thing to understand when we think of slavery and we read the Bible, we can tend in our mind to think of like the movie 12 Years a Slave or something like that. But in reality, slavery within the confines of the Old Testament was quite a different thing. Many people who became slaves as a result of being prisoners of war. There was a battle, they were on the losing side, and they entered into slavery. In a lot of cases, they entered into slavery willingly because a lot of people groups at that time, when there was a war between nations and you were on the losing side, it was quite common to say, you know what we should do? We should wipe out all of these people because what we don't want to do is to have this battle again 5 years down the road. So it was quite common in the region at the time to just wipe people out when there was a battle. And so oftentimes people would voluntarily enter into slavery because the alternative was to be killed. So, given those two potential outcomes, it wasn't a terrible result. The other thing I would say is that people could voluntarily enter into a slavery arrangement where if somebody owed a debt to someone, they could enter into a slavery arrangement. They could work until the debt was paid. But as I said before, the Old Testament law quite radically restricted the ways in which slaves were treated. So, to cite an example, somebody who killed a slave, for example, was guilty of murder, and they could themselves receive the death penalty. Which, again, if we think of like antebellum slavery in the US, if I put my own slave to death, the way the law was written in the US, if I put my own slave to death, I just disposed of my own property. I can do whatever I want with my own property. So the standards were hugely different. The other thing I would say under the Old Testament law, slaves had to be set free every 7 years. That was referred to as the Year of Jubilee. So the longest that you could keep a slave was for 7 years, and then you had to set them free. So that was the biblical perspective on slavery, and as I say, not really reflected here in the article. Number 8 here, bizarre death penalties. Probably not much more to add here as far as, life and death. I mean, we've already talked about life and death quite a bit. As I said, God gets to decide who goes, when, and how. Within the Old Testament law, and I feel like we've talked about the Old Testament law a lot, we talked about how the law often pictures things about who God is and what he does. And here, I think when we look at these death penalty situations, as we said before, the law enables people to pursue up to those penalties. They didn't always happen. So when we look at this first example here of the stubborn and rebellious son, I think the first thing that this gives us is how serious the Bible takes it for our children, our offspring, to respect their parents, to respect those that came before them. Again, I think the seriousness of the sentence is a reflection of how much that is valued in the culture. But again, it doesn't mean that every time your child is rebellious, you just simply execute them. A great example of this would be in the New Testament would be the prodigal son, who was certainly stubborn and rebellious. So one of the aspects of that narrative that kind of impacts how we view it is that under the law, the father of the prodigal son could have had him put to death. When the prodigal son returned home, he could have had the son put to death under the direction of the law. But instead, the father willingly welcomed him home. So what do we see? We see that those penalties were not always enacted just because there was a legal ground to pursue them. Down to and I guess the second article, or the second scripture reference here regarding sex with an animal, I would say a similar thing, that this just is a picture again of how important God viewed sexual purity and the appropriateness of sexual relationships, that such a stern penalty was attached to the violation of that. Now, moving down, number 9, the denigration of handicapped people. The very first passage here: no one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. I'm going to be honest, I think this first passage is really reaching. I mean, it seems kind of obvious to me, but this passage clearly isn't talking about someone born with a disability. I mean, clearly there are verbs in the passage, right? This is something that has been done to somebody. And specifically, in the context that this was written, it was not uncommon in the nations around Israel for people to mutilate themselves in this way as an element of pagan worship. So the passage here isn't saying, don't come to the assembly of the Lord if you've mutilated yourself. It's saying, don't mutilate yourself, right? I think this one's kind of really obvious. And like I say, I think sometimes when people do write stuff like this with maybe an intent to denigrate the Bible in some way, sometimes there's kind of a bit of an overreach into the ridiculous. And I think maybe that one kind of crosses the line. Like I said, it's not talking about people born disabled, and it's not telling people who've mutilated themselves not to come into the assembly. It's saying, don't mutilate yourself. I think that one's like super clear. The second passage from Leviticus chapter 21, it says, whosoever hath any blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of God. I was skipping forward here. Or crookback or dwarf, or that have a blemish in his eye, or be scurvy or scabbed, or has stones broken, he shall not go unto the veil, nor come nigh unto the altar, because he hath a blemish. So when the text here mentions coming under the veil or approaching the altar, this was a function that only the priesthood would perform in Israel. So yet again, the law is often a picture of what God will do, and ultimately, what does God do? Ultimately, he sends his son, Jesus Christ, who lives a sinless life and gives up that life to die on a cross to atone for the sin of humanity. Now, if Jesus wasn't sinless, then he couldn't atone for the sins of others. So if you want to paint a picture of that in the Old Testament law, how do you do it? Well, you can't only let sinless people come to the altar and serve in the priesthood, because apart from the Son of God, Jesus Christ, there are no sinless people. So there would be nobody working in the priesthood. But the other thing is, even if you could find sinless people to come serve in the priesthood, you wouldn't necessarily know it to look at them, right? The picture would be lost because you can't look at someone and know that they're sinless, right? A picture isn't very useful if you can't see what you're supposed to see. So rather than excluding sin, what the law does is it excludes those with physical blemishes as a representation that when Jesus comes and dies, it will be only the spiritually unblemished that can come before God. So again, there's a purpose in the picture here. Now, there's a couple more sections here, and then we're done. Section number 10, moral edicts that demand too much. The first passage says, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none, and anyone who has food should do the same. I guess I don't really understand here how this demands too much. It was quite common at the time when this was written that everybody would basically own one outfit. You would own your work clothes, and that's what you would wear all the time. So somebody that has 2 shirts is really doing quite well. And so the text is saying, if you own two shirts, you should consider sharing some of what you have with someone who has none. Again, I'm not sure why this would be a controversial point or seen as like a ridiculously high bar that nobody could ever attain to. In the comment above in the article, it says, if you want to send a conservative Bible believer into a froth, try suggesting that Jesus was a socialist. Well, I don't think that would send me into a froth, but it's kind of a silly claim because what Jesus is doing in this passage is he's calling on people to exercise a free choice, to note that they have more than they need, and then choose to share some of what they have with a person of their choosing. That's not socialism. Socialism is you earn what you earn, and then the government steps in and takes away a chunk that they choose, and they give it to who they choose. Regardless of whether you like it or not, you get whatever's left, right? If you think that calling people to charity is the same as socialism, I'm not sure how I could point it out more clearly. Charity and socialism are quite markedly different. They're not the same thing at all. The second passage from Ephesians, nor should there be any obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking. Again, I'm not really sure what the issue is here. And to be fair, the article doesn't really say what the issue is here. They didn't really comment in the article as to what we should be doing. So, I mean, are they saying that we should be upholding obscenity, foolish talk, and coarse joking? I mean, if they're saying that, they didn't say that, so it's not clear. I don't know. It's not clear what they're saying is bad about that. It's not clear what they think we should be doing. And then the very last section here, passages that are a waste of brain space and paper. They didn't cite any such passages. What they do comment at the bottom of the article, what I found was that most of the Bible was neither horrible nor inspiring. It was simply dull and irrelevant, long genealogies written by men obsessed with racial purity. How do you know what the writers of the Bible were obsessed with? Not sure how you would know that. On top of that, it was badly written, with some stories garbled, others repeated, though rarely in complete argument about the facts. The Bible's supposed author seemed like a psychological mess, and I found myself irritated. With a finite number of pages to set the course of human history, this was the best he could do. Okay, but I mean, an estimated 2 billion Christians in the world today, and all of them following after one Israelite man. So if Jesus's goal was to build a church, and he said it was, then, I mean, that seems to be going quite well. And then, of course, the other thing is, if the claims of the Bible are in fact true, then that church of 2 billion people are destined for eternity in the direct presence of God. So regardless of what you make of the book, I mean, things seem to be going fairly well, I think. And then their closing statement here: thank God, Bible-believing Christians don't take the good book as seriously as they claim to. Well, or maybe your views of what Bible-believing Christians do are simply inaccurate. So that's our video for today. I don't know about you. I find some of those arguments just kind of exhausting. I don't know if it's just kind of a human nature thing, but I find I can study the Bible for a couple hours, no problem. But stuff like this that just seems to constantly throw dirt, I don't know, it just seems to kind of wear on you a little bit. But as I said at the beginning, I wanted to do this for a reason. I think a lot of Christians can shy away from conversations like this because they feel maybe these types of arguments don't have decent responses to them. I think sometimes also people feel like if they write a lot of words that attack Christianity or attack the Bible, that nobody will engage and respond. Um, and I think, sometimes people just feel like it's our lot as Christians to just sit back and take it. Um, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there are coherent answers to who God is. I think there are coherent answers to why the Bible says what it says, and I don't think we need to be shy about sharing them. So that's the video. Again, I hope it's been helpful. Feel free to like, to subscribe, leave a comment if you wish. And if you would like to get a hold of me for any reason, if you have a question, a suggestion for a video, anything like that, feel free to drop me a line, thegospelofjohn@gmail.com. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. God bless you. Hope you have a great day.